was always kind of taught to dream big and think like a leader.
How can we hack the system?
We are producers to its core. We're makers.
That was that moment where I was like, yes, like this was a big one to put us on the map.
Creativity is messy. Perfect is boring.
That to me is good creative. That to me is success.
You can see talent in people.
We want to go create the next best brand in the world.
This is who we are and this is what we do.
This is Creative's Offscript. Davey Spens is the creative director of entertainment at Stept Studios, a title that draws on his experience as a producer and writer for projects from Viceland to YouTube originals to Converse and more. Davey spearheads a television-style development process mixed with a traditional digital production model to create branded entertainment that leaves, as he describes, fingerprints on culture. Welcome to our show, Davey.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Tell me your backstory, first of all. Where are you from and what did you want to be when you grew up?
I grew up in Winchester, which is a city an hour outside London, and I never really fit anywhere. I think the trajectory of my life has always been about never quite fitting in kind of any space or environment. I have a print in my house which said, "The things that made you weird as a kid will make you great tomorrow." And I think everything about my life has been about being a misfit. So my journey in the creative industry has followed suit. I don't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be a pirate when I was 10-year-old. And I guess that spirit kind of lived on. I didn't know what I wanted to study. So I ended up studying like Egyptian theology and sociology and psychology at university in this kind of weird combined degree, and fell into radio. I had a radio show at university and it won the show of the year. It was a sports show. And so I ended up chasing radio for a couple of years before I fell into advertising. And so I suppose the first kind of chapter of my career was spent as a strategist and then as a creative at BBDO in London and the Brooklyn Brothers. Yeah, and so I kind of started out in advertising. I veered off and explored kind of screenwriting. I wrote a book of short stories for a big coffee chain called Costa Coffee in the UK. Sold 1 million copies. It was strange.
Wow.
And then launched a design studio with the Indie Mag. We used to own a travel magazine that we launched as a little gang of like 6 designers, and then met Pulse Films. And I think it was in an era where a lot of my friends were working in music, and I was kind of creative directing musicians and artists. And in that era, Pulse was creating some amazing music films, and they kind of asked me to come along as a creative director. So that was kind of my arrival in the world of kind of television and film, and it's kind of gone from there.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you say you never really felt like you fit into a box, because I think looking into your career, you have touched so many different areas. You were an art director, a strategist, creative director, producer, writer. How would you describe yourself in terms of your unique skill set?
I kind of describe myself as an originator. This is full disclosure. I'm not especially good at detail. I'm more kind of a big picture person. And so I've always found people say to me, "Why weren't you a director?" And I was like, well, there's always people who can execute things better than I can. I always feel like my strength is coming up with ideas, originating new thoughts, and doing 1 million things at once. And so I kind of love the ability to work over a portfolio of projects at one time and find space between things and come up with new stuff. So I've always struggled with a job title. Even before we had this call, we were talking about my job title of, is it a showrunner or was it an exec producer? I think it's all of these things. I just love to bring this kind of like instinctive energy to projects.
Yeah. And so, as you mentioned, you early in your career bounced around between agency, freelance, creative work, and then eventually founded your own design studio, Boat Studio. Reflecting on that, what would you say were some highs and lows of running your own company?
I'd left the kind of biggest advertising agency in London, and so I wanted to do something small. And it was called Boat because I never wanted it to be bigger than a rowing boat, the number of people you could fit in a rowing boat. And so it was 6 of us. And the idea was we could just pick projects we liked and work on them. I loved the independence we had. I love the fact that we could split our time between commercial projects and then this very pure thing, which was this magazine called Boat Magazine, which took everybody in the studio. Every 6 months, we picked ourselves up and plopped ourselves down in a new city to make a kind of culture publication about a different space. And so we picked complicated cities, like Sarajevo was our first issue. So 6 of us moved to Sarajevo. We worked with local writers and creatives there to make this magazine. And I just published it almost as a portfolio piece for the company, but it sold out in a week. And so we just kept going. The stupidity of it was called Boat Magazine, and kind of you would find it in Barnes & Noble in the boating section. So it was a misnomer.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I enjoyed the versatility of having my own thing. And I still, I guess, try to approach every role I have with a degree of like entrepreneurialism and try and carve new space in the roles I have in companies for us to do things that we haven't done before as a company or as a department. And so our approach at Stept to branded entertainment is actually driven by that energy of like, well, what do we want to make? And let's go and find some brands who also want to tell those stories. And that's one way that we kind of keep that wide-eyed approach to making things that I think is what creatives are all about. They get most excited about telling stories that have meaning or doing things that are new. And so I try and bring that boat energy to every role I have, really.
Yeah. And that's a crazy concept. So you say the entire team would move to a new city for 6 months?
Every 6 months for 2 weeks. We'd move for like 2 weeks and then come back.
Got it.
So it was one of the perks of being small enough was that we could do things like that. So we went to Sarajevo and we sent some cheeky emails and made some cheeky phone calls and ended up having amazing conversations with people and then publishing a magazine. And then 6 months later, we went to Detroit and did the second issue. And it was always about kind of complicated cities that normally a journalist would fly into to get one story they had researched and then fly back out of. But it was like, let's just spend long enough in a place that we actually get to understand what it's about and we let the city tell us what to tell. The idea being that if you read our magazine on an airplane on the way to that city, you'd have a totally different perspective on the place you visited. So it was kind of like a deep reading of a place that was incredibly human.
Yeah. It's a really cool concept. It seems really ahead of its time too. It's almost a little bit like digital nomading before digital nomading became a thing. So really interesting. And so from that company, you then got connected with Glass Animals and were an art director for them. Tell me how that happened and how you originally got connected with the band.
I had a daughter and I was in the park and pushing her in a swing. And there was somebody next to me also pushing their kid in a swing. And we got talking. And it turned out that was Paul Epworth, Adele's producer, who had just signed this band, Glass Animals, and when they were they were playing pubs in Oxford. And so he asked if I would help with the art direction. And so it was one of those very organic things. I had already created album artwork for this band, Australian band, the Temper Trap. It was the kind of first project I did, pure art project at the Boat Studio, and it won Artwork of the Year. And that was kind of an amazing experience because it led me into doing stage work and live shows and stuff. And then, so when I met Paul, he just asked if I would come and help. And so I ended up kind of creative directing their artwork and stage shows for the Zaba album, which was their kind of breakout album, which was a great experience. I mean, it was overseeing an incredible illustrator, Mika Lidberg, who did all the artwork. But the concept was that it was a very conceptual album based on the lead singer Dave's love for this book that he grew up with, that lived in this dreamlike jungle space. So the whole idea of the whole approach to the album cycle was just to create these really immersive jungle experiences and to push that through all the artwork. So it came from there. And I really played a similar role. I kind of originated and oversaw illustrators and directors and filmmakers and kind of bringing a very visceral world to life.
Yeah, that sounds like a really amazing project to work on. Did you tour with them throughout that?
I did a couple of installations before I left London, and then I moved to LA. So I moved to LA over the launch of the record. So I didn't get to explore too much with the band then because I was kind of starting out at Vice and Pulse in LA.
Got it.
So, but they've gone on to become the biggest thing. I mean, I think the Heatwave song they recently had sat on the top 40, sat number one in the US Billboard for 4 weeks, a year after it was released, which is crazy. So, yeah.
If you're enjoying this podcast, then check out Great Big Photography World Podcast, featuring inspiring conversations with passionate photographers from around the world. There's something for everyone in this podcast, with a focus on various genres of photography, editing, creative block, business, and much more. If you want to take your photography to the next level, listen to Great Big Photography World Podcast on your preferred podcast platform or on greatbigphotographyworld.com. And so talking about that move to LA, now was that just like a blind jump, like I'm going to go to LA and figure it out? Or had you already connected with Pulse Films at that point and moved for the company?
I was working at Pulse Films in the London office, freelance, for about a year and a half before I moved. It was a really interesting time because Pulse had just started a very close relationship with Vice. It was before Vice invested in them. And Vice had a huge office on Abbot Kinney in LA. So as Pulse looked to push into television and film and branding and commercials out in the States, they took a space in the Vice office, which is where the office began. So I joined when Pulse was just starting out stateside, which again was a really interesting time because there was a lot of big, high-profile projects that Pulse was running through the LA office, including like Beyonce Lemonade and things like that. So it was an exciting time. For sure.
Yeah. And was this your first foray into branded entertainment with Pulse?
I think so, yeah. I mean, so having started in advertising, I knew the brand world really well. And the first few years at Pulse, I was kind of thrown into TV and film in a way that I maybe perhaps didn't have that much experience in before. And what was really interesting was being able to talk the language of both. And sitting in a space where these two worlds of marketing and branding and entertainment were coming together and finding that in most cases that it didn't always make such a happy marriage. It felt like sometimes from the marketing side, there were creators that didn't understand entertainment, and on the entertainment side, producers and who maybe didn't quite grasp the nuances of marketing and what's necessary and what's needed. And so it felt like there was this great opportunity to sit in the middle and cast different people around the table. And the piece I felt was missing specifically was development. A brief would come and then we would jump to a director's treatment. But there wasn't this space actually to develop thoughtful entertainment that happened in the middle. And so my years at Pulse was spent kind of like exploring that and feeling that out. We had an amazing roster of directors, and so often briefs jumped straight to them. And I sat in the middle just wanting to do more development. And I think that's what led me to this push to Stept is let's try a slightly different model. Like how can we couple an entertainment development model with digital production? And I think that's where our success is coming from at the moment.
And how is that model different?
Well, I mean, so 5-10 years ago, you'd sit at a production company and a brief would come from a major sports brand and it would be, we want 12 films about courage. And then 4 of our directors would come back with, why don't we make a short film about a female boxer? And there are only so many films about female boxers that you can watch. And so I felt like, okay, how can I help get to more interesting start points? The television development model for me is how can we get to more interesting start points for branded entertainment? And so that's the process. At Stept, we have there's kind of 2 routes in. One is brands come to us asking for us to treat on ideas they already have with RFPs. But the majority of the work we do is coming up with concepts and collections of ideas of things we want to see in the world. And then going out with our sales team to find, and with our relationships with existing brands, to find companies and brands that want to sponsor those films or tell them themselves. And so I suppose the thing that excites me the most, honestly, are developing those sorts of ideas that we want to make and going out and finding people to tell them.
Yeah.
Which was a story actually of this recent project we launched with Smirnoff just last week. I was sitting at home in the pandemic and just felt like it would be interesting to tell stories of different corners of America, different subcultures that were finding ways to play. that were grappling with issues of community and belonging. So why don't we find some communities that were creating safe spaces for people to play? And we had a great relationship with Diageo. So we talked to the people at Smirnoff, and they told us they had, well, their platform that they were coming out with was called Vodka for the People. And this was a perfect match. And so we ended up kind of co-developing this series that told stories. It's called Come On In. And it's these portraits of America, the different communities of America at play. And it's a super inclusive, welcoming series of films that are like just beautiful portraits of subcultures. So there's a roller skating group in Atlanta. There's the drag community of Chicago, and there's sound system culture in Bed-Stuy. And there are 3 different directors, 3 films. And it's kind of like, honestly, I think it turned out to be that kind of like perfect project for me, which started from a really pure idea of like, let's create this infectious film that gives people permission to kind of play or just relax a bit and celebrate those safe spaces in America that allow people to live their truth and be 100% themselves. And that totally, just randomly, it seemed to totally align with what Smirnoff were looking for. And so like, that's a real success for us. It just got the Vimeo staff pick. It's one of those. It's one of those moments where I wish we could make 10 more of those, honestly, of just these collections of pure documentary films that really work against what a brand is trying to communicate to.
Yeah. I watched the roller skating one. That one was great. I love that. And it's interesting talking to you. I'm seeing a bit of a through line. It feels almost like Boat magazine, right? Like now coming to life in films, exploring the culture that you may not see at first glance.
There was this amazing series Nokia made with Some Such called New American Noise. It must be 12 years old now. And it was I cite it as maybe one of my favorite ever examples of branded entertainment. And it's very gentle in some ways. It's just 6 episodes, 6 different musical subcultures in America, and 6 different directors. And it's amazing. And I spent my whole time at Pulse wanting to try and make something like that. And Smirnoff has some of the same kind of body language. It was just, there's something pure about filmmaking. And Stept is an interesting company because it was founded by professional skiers, and they were just shooting films because they loved it. They were innovating and finding different ways to shoot themselves and their sport. And the company grew out of there. And so at the heart of Stept is this love for, and I call it human capacity, the things that we as humans can do and be and believe and achieve. Like, they framed it in the world of sport. But I think that spirit is something we're trying to explore in the entertainment department of like, let's find pure human stories that explore our capacity as people and what we can do. And let's couple it with filmmakers that are visionary and that like to innovate. And that's the formula really at Stept, is very story driven, very human centric. And it's chasing this idea. And when you said earlier that I talked about films and projects that like leave their fingerprints in culture, I think there's an appetite in all of us to make things that are worthwhile and are meaningful. And they can be meaningful with a small M or meaningful with a big M. They can change things and they can change minds, or they can just make someone feel less alone for a second, or plant a new thought or idea that inspires them to do something. And I suppose that kind of heartbeat lies behind everything we try and do at Stept, whether it's a commercial or a piece of branded entertainment, or whether it's one of the TV series we're taking out at the moment.
And to dig into that process a little more, I'm just interested to learn more about the model. So correct me if I'm wrong, and actually I'd just love to hear from you as well, but it sounds like you are ideating original content, original series, original everything between you and the directors on your roster. And then once you have a piece of content that you want to see created and put out into the world, you'll approach brands that you feel like are a good fit and sell them on it to see if they want to sponsor and help create it.
That's how it's begun. And as a result of that, now we have relationships with 3 brands that we are development partners of. And so out of sharing ideas that they love and having conversations about the kind of ideas they want to make, we have kind of formalized relationships with 3 brands now where we work as their development wing of their brand in some ways. And so it's this collaborative idea where I will do a workshop with them, and we'll come away and we'll develop 8 log lines up and we'll go and explore them. One might be a TV thing, one might be a digital thing. And it's this beautiful, like, collaborative process where we can work as partners of brands where we're not just shooting in the dark, but we're using all our origination and power just to come up with thoughtful ideas that can really work, that move the needle for a brand in some ways. So it's almost like, that's almost like the third way we work now, is having these, and I think it's a new thing. I don't know many other companies that work like this, but like formalized development relationships with 3 brands. And then we have speculative ideas that I'll just develop, and then we'll go and take out and have conversations with brands. And then we respond to RFPs that come in. And so that kind of mix of things is what kind of swirls around the day-to-day.
Yeah, that's a really interesting model. And it reminds me, honestly, of like the studio model, right? Where you have a production company and they have like a first look deal, and you're basically developing in the similar method as you would with the studio, which brings up even more interesting concepts, because as they say these days, brands are becoming media companies, right? And it's not so much anymore about advertising, it's about creating an actual media platform. So that's really interesting that you talk about that, how you fit into that model as a development partner, really like fueling their content that is that media platform that they're trying to create.
And I think what's interesting about it is we try to structure it in a really easy way, because it's a whole new world for a lot of brands. So the 3 brands that we're working with in that way, they've all created branded entertainment and content before, and maybe felt a little dissatisfied with what had been created in the past. And so we just try to create a gentle forum where we can be collaborative and trust each other and start to explore things. Without working with necessarily their above the line agency. It's just working with them to develop like entertainment ideas. One's a big financial company, one's a sports company, and one's a media brand. And so they're all completely different. And for me, the piece I love most about branded entertainment is a brand gives you a whole different start point for an idea you otherwise wouldn't have. So, for example, if I was working with a brand like Sephora, it would open up a whole world of thought about entertainment ideas that I wouldn't sit down and come up with for a pure entertainment play. I'll be starting to explore ideas in the realms of beauty that maybe I wouldn't have thought about if I was just coming up with TV shows in pure entertainment world. And so those are the pieces that excite me, is about coming to more interesting start points for ideas. And every brand is loaded with different springboards, whether it's from the brand, whether it's from product, whether it's from their audience, whether it's from their category. These workshops are amazing because we spend time thinking about each of them. And what ends up falling out are these amazing springboards for entertainment ideas that you'd otherwise never get to. I think that's the kind of nuts thing about branded entertainment. It used to be such a dirty word. It was branded content. I saw a guy walking down the street yesterday with a T-shirt and said, "I love branded content," and it was an ironic T-shirt. But it was a picture of what the world used to look like. And actually what excites me about branded entertainment are all these different start points that could lead to anything. So yeah, we try and create a space that dreams a bit for brands rather than feels like it has to fit into these tram lines.
And do you always have a brand in mind when you're concepting? Or is some of this just pure front blank piece of paper?
Not necessarily. It could come from a story or something that someone sends me or something we see. But I try every month and think of a different category and develop ideas around the category. So if we're talking about Gen Z finance, you can come up with a lot of interesting things. So for example, it's more about thinking in kind of a category way, developing as maybe 4 or 5 different ideas, and I'll develop them up as almost like series treatments and then go share them with brands.
Got it.
And sometimes, you know what, within that the collection of films thing is one thing I love the most, because we can create a collection of films with this big promise, which can tie into kind of like what a brand's looking for. In the end, they may just go, you know what, I really love this story. Let's go make this as a short film, and we'll go do that too. So they're almost like springboards to bigger conversations. And sometimes, like, whether someone bites on a series idea we want to make, or whether it just leads to an amazing conversation about how we could work together or what we could develop. That's just it's all part of having better conversations and starting them earlier rather than receiving these RFPs that we just need to execute on. I just love the development piece.
Yeah. Have you ever gone out and won a brand new client with a branded entertainment pitch? Like, not that you had a previous relationship with shooting commercials, or, just like, you don't know me, we don't know you, but we have this incredible idea for your brand. let's go make it. Does that happen, or is it usually through an existing relationship?
It does happen. It's happened in the past at Step with like individual films where a director has found an amazing story they want to tell, and then they go find a brand who wants to tell it. And so that has happened. It's honestly, I don't know how it happens at Step, but it happens more often than not. There's a sales team that has great relationships with brands, and these conversations are happening all the time. And when I joined the company, this was a dream I always had to do at Pulse. I always wanted to do this proactive approach, and we never pulled it off. And I moved to a company where, for whatever reason, these conversations are happening all the time. And so there are 2 or 3 examples of short films, not series, that are happening right now that are born from those conversations.
Nice.
So it does happen. I know it's I think the interesting thing is the industry is more open than ever now to these kind of conversations. I think what will create a step change, honestly, is a little more strategic thinking, entertainment strategy for brands, where we can almost quantify the why, and then we can measure the effectiveness of it. And I think that's one piece at the moment that branded entertainment is missing. I was talking to a friend of mine who works in entertainment strategy, and he had a really smart approach by, like, brands know their audiences way better than streaming platforms know their audiences. Like, it's nuts to think, if you begin to think of brands as media brands, they have granular data about who their audience is and what they do, who their consumer base is. They know their consumers way better than a television platform will ever understand its audience. And yet we don't use that information to create entertainment products. We use them in other ways. And I think there'll be a shift in branded entertainment when we start to employ some proper entertainment strategy around some of the consumer insights that we have that can show just why it works. And I think there's some logical leaps that happen often, as these types of people probably like to watch these kind of shows. And actually, we can tell you what shows they watch. We can tell you that actually they skew a little bit more to nonfiction, or I don't know what it is, but I think that's going to be a really interesting phase in the next round of the development of branded entertainment world, is actually how we can use insights and data in a more interesting way. And on the flip side, there's a whole effectiveness piece that I think is missing, that I think sometimes can be quite hard to score the impact of brand entertainment. And I think that's a piece I'd love to spend a little bit more time figuring out too.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Just brings up a lot of thoughts. I mean, you're absolutely right. These brands understand their customers better than anybody and could tailor entertainment around that. And even just to think of the community that would come out of that, like building a community of fans around that entertainment that's created specifically for them. I mean, for a brand, the value in that it would be incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's crazy.
Producers, are you sick of messy projects, outdated calendars, hundreds of email chains, and lost files? Have you dreamed of one tool that can bring your entire production workflow together in one place? Assemble is the project management platform designed by producers for producers, featuring calendars, task lists, call sheets, asset management, and more. Assemble helps industry-leading production companies, agencies, and brands streamline their content production workflow. Try Assemble today using the code Offscript, that's one word, to get your first month free. Learn more at assemble.tv. You are listening to the Creatives Offscript podcast. And so tell me about when you're pitching a piece of branded entertainment. I'm curious how far you go in the pitch. Like, I mean, I'm sure you're putting together treatments and decks and mood boards and these types of things, but is there ever a situation where you're just like, we love this idea, we know it's amazing, we're just going to go shoot it and sell it to them after, or we're going to put together a proof of concept or something like that?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. I think Steps is a company that makes entertainment, not just develops entertainment. And I think there's lots of production companies out there that trade in ideas, but Stept has a huge post-production team under its roof, huge VFX team under its roof. We have sound stages, we have kit rental. Everything within this company is kind of end to end. And so it enables us to create materials that are brilliant. And so, like, I love to make a sizzle. I'm a writer, so I love to write a deck, and I was an art director. I love the way decks can look, and sometimes you can spend 2 weeks polishing a 60-page beautiful presentation, to know that someone on the receiving end clicks through it mindlessly and sees 10 slides out of the 60. And yet you can craft a 2-minute piece of film that blows people away. And so we're increasingly doing a lot more work on the latter side. I would say not so with early pitches for brand entertainment projects, more for the pure TV and film projects we're developing at the moment. They all tend to have a really beautiful crafted sizzle with, there's one I would love to show and talk about that's amazing. It's kind of a subcultural series we've just been shooting in Appalachian Mountains, and the sizzle's breathtaking. And it's kind of like these, like, we're filmmakers, and you can talk about it, and you can talk about how important the delivery of a piece, the execution of a piece is, but then you can show it. And I was having a conversation just before this one with the people at We Transfer and We Present about how important it is for brand entertainment pieces to have a creative integrity. And it's something that is really important to their audience, but it's something that's really important to our audience too. And so when we say we're filmmaker first and story first, being able to talk to a brand, and this is an interesting thing about brand entertainment, is how creatively integrate the piece is. I always say we try and brand the frame and not the film. We don't need to see product shots every 32 frames, right? Like, to work well as a piece of brand and entertainment, I just want to be able to articulate something around the frame of it that lets the story in the middle be pure and work. And I think that's where the idea of like developing a thought behind the film that works for the brand is more important than trying to fit the product through it. And developing a platform for a collection of films that really speaks to their audience and what that brand is wanting to do, that just allows the films to be films. And I suppose, like, my approach to things has always been kind of top down and high concept, and developing these kind of powerful, like, collection of film concepts that works to a brand thing, so we can be kind of pure in the middle, if you know what I mean. Which I know wasn't your question because you were asking me about sizzles and making things, but
No, that was great. That was great. I mean, so much good insights in that. I was just, as my gears turning, honestly. And first of all, as a creative like yourself, it must be amazing to have this production machine with Stept Studios from pre to post where you can execute these ideas. Sounds like a dream. But my next question was, this always comes into the equation whenever you're talking about commerce at the end of the day, but how do you measure the results of branded entertainment?
I mean, this is a big question, I think. Traditionally, branded entertainment was seen as a nice to have. It was seen as an extension of a campaign. It was never seen as the campaign itself. And so the hard data tracking of brand entertainment is almost non-existent. I think often people chase kind of softer metrics and we'll look at clicks and engagement in a very soft way. I like to think of it as the point of entertainment is to engage. The point of entertainment is to reward someone for paying attention. That was a line Matt Groening said about The Simpsons. He said, everyone's going to watch The Simpsons, but I want to reward people for paying attention. And I guess when we make entertainment, I think that philosophy is really smart. It's like, if I'm going to spend time with you, I want you to receive something and feel something. And so if we're doing our job properly, the films we create will leave a residue and they will leave fingerprints. Effectiveness for me is about that. Effectiveness for me is leaving something behind and leaving fingerprints and rewarding someone for spending time with you. So I look at entertainment in that way. If you do it perfectly, people will want to talk about it and they'll share it. If you do it brilliantly, it will reach a big audience. And so I see the virtue of branded entertainment as being a way of brands engaging their audience in a way that is meaningful and purposeful that they maybe aren't doing in other areas. But I think there's lots of work to do about quantifying that effectiveness. And I also think there's a lot more work that should be done about making sure the right audiences and the biggest audiences see it. Because far too often we're creating these films as almost like a cherry on top of a campaign, but there's not much intention behind how people are reached and how many people see it. And I guess everybody has a slightly different objective as in the marketing department about what they want to do. And maybe it's a festival play. And that can work. And a lot of the pieces we do have a festival strategy behind them, but they don't necessarily have an audience strategy behind them, bigger than that. And that's okay if that's the objective. Like, my goal is just to make entertaining films that that leave something behind. But I would love collectively as an industry for us to take seriously the effectiveness side of it, to begin to prove the power of these things that we innately feel so that we can do them better and we can do more of them.
Yeah, I mean, it is so difficult to measure. And at the end of the day, it's about mind share and positioning, I think, in the consumer mind. An example that comes to mind is MusicBed. Are you familiar with MusicBed?
Yeah.
We had Daniel McCarthy, the founder, on this podcast, and we were talking a bit about, I think they were one of the early pioneers with branded entertainment, honestly, in terms of a tech platform, at least, because they would put out these like beautiful films of, these behind the scenes or like just films about filmmaking. And, he told me when I chatted with him that people would come up to give him compliments and he'd be like, yeah, but did you like it? Did you leave a comment? Did you share it? Like, he was always looking for the return. But, now there's so many music licensing platforms out there, but I think that MusicBed still stands above the rest. And I think a big piece of that is this branded entertainment that they're doing and the way it's positioned themselves as they connect with their audience,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the thing that heartens me the most is how the conversation has moved from kind of branded content to branded entertainment, and how big the industry is becoming and how seriously it's being taken. Because as if the whole thought and spirit behind it is audience first. And I love that. The whole point of entertainment is audience first. And in that beautiful like space where what the audience wants to watch and what the brand wants to talk about kind of overlap, is where we can create really dynamic ideas that do stick in the memory, that are shared, that do move the needle. And like that MusicBed example, there's a reason why someone will consider one brand over another and one product over another. And it's about the space it takes up in their brain and about the experiences they've had and touch points they've had with that brand.
Yeah.
And saying all that, honestly, I cited at the beginning, my favorite example of branded entertainment came from Nokia. And so I don't know where they are now. But but the point, that's the conversation, isn't it? It kind of like, it's a space in the industry that feels like not the Wild West. It used to feel like the Wild West, and now it feels like this kind of very fluid space where new ideas are happening and there's an appetite for more and for how things can be shaped in different ways. Someone once told me about the thermodynamics of creativity and how ideas come out of chaos and you cool them down into a liquid. And the industry and like kind of corporate culture will always try and make it rigid so they know what to do with it. They'll try and make it into a solid. And the trick with creativity is to keep everything as fluid as possible, but not be too chaotic. And I think brand entertainment is in that fluid space at the moment. And I think that's why it's an exciting place to be, because there aren't too many rules, but there are some. And the trick, I think, is not to try and like put too many rigid guardrails around it and make it into a solid that we can do something with. I think the exciting space is where it is right now, in that kind of like fluid middle, where we can experiment with time lengths and platforms, where we have the space to actually just push for a pure festival play. How beautiful as a brief is it when a brand comes and says, I just want to do something for the festival circuit in an entertainment space? I mean, it's perfect for us. And so existing in that fluid middle is nice.
And what do you think the future of branded entertainment looks like? And can you think of any, recent examples of just really innovative branded entertainment or concepts that are giving you insight into where this is all heading?
I think the future of branded entertainment is that more and more brands are creating entertainment, and that's it. I think the interesting thing is, like, I was talking to the Apple team yesterday from Apple TV. And what's really interesting is the Apple brand is still the prism within which everything is made. Everything that guides the editorial voice is Apple. And yet it's a streaming platform. And it was kind of a moment where I kind of sat back and thought about how impressive it was that a brand like Apple had taken the idea of brands as media platforms. And here it is as a streaming platform. And their prism as a brand is the editorial prism with which things are commissioned and created. I thought that was really interesting. So I would say I think they're probably the best example of branded entertainment. And it seems strange because they're the biggest company in the world. But what they've done is actually the purest translation of the idea of a brand operating as a media platform that there is.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. And that's very, very meta. But it's so true. You know, when I started watching shows on Apple TV, I actually realized like a difference in the production and quality. You know, like I was watching various series on Apple and I was like, wow, these feel Apple. Like the production feels higher quality. It's like crisper, like the VFX are incredible. You know, and I wondered at that time if that's something that's actually a part of their strategy. Like every show we produce will be of the highest possible production quality, you know?
It is, and also there's certain subjects they won't touch. They don't touch religion. They don't. Everything about it is through the Apple prism, and I think it's just really interesting. I actually interviewed. I had a conversation with the head of content over there a long time ago, and he told me the number of shows they just killed. They shot and killed because they didn't hit that bar of standard. It's the opposite of the Netflix approach where everything's thrown into the abyss. It's like here, there's a bar there that's interesting, and so I thought that was fascinating because there is a quality threshold there. There's also an editorial tone that goes through the Apple prism about creativity and the kind of a wide-eyed approach that's very human. Like you could sit and watch the shows and you could list out the themes, and it would all feel like a celebration of everything Apple is from a very soft space. You know, and so I found that fascinating because I hadn't thought about that before yesterday. But there was this moment where I was like, I think actually the purest brand of entertainment in the world is the Apple TV platform.
Yeah, that's so true. And speaking of streaming platforms, what are you watching these days?
I watch so much TV. I think this is one of the things, until the pandemic, I don't think I watched that much TV. I watched TV and I would pick at things. Now, through the whole pandemic era, I've watched so many interesting things. I've been watching The Bear on Hulu because everyone's watching The Bear, and I'm like, I quite like it. There's a series on Hulu which is only 2 episodes, but it's called The School That Tried to Eradicate Racism, and it's a kind of social experiment in British public school that just came up on Hulu. That's really fascinating. I've been watching the Home series on Apple, actually, which I think is great. I'll tell you what's an interesting thing in TV at the moment is I get very easily sucked into these 4 or 6 hour part, like 6 hour long stories on documentary true crime things on kind of Netflix and HBO. And I kind of really love them in the pandemic. And now I really like questioning the length of things. And I think trying to hit the perfect length for entertainment is going to be an interesting, someone told me, oh, you should watch this thing on Netflix at the moment. I can't remember the title of it now. It was The Girl in the Picture. It's groundbreaking. And it was groundbreaking because it's feature length rather than it's 4 hour long episodes. And it's not groundbreaking. It's more that finally we're in a space where we can have conversations about length. And it's not just about stretching material to the point where it's like Bad Vegan, a show which was kind of stretched to the point where I lost interest. And so I think looking at how things are cut and presented and served up is an interesting space at the moment, and thinking about format. There was I used to love anthologies. I still love anthologies. And that we're in an era in TV where anthology is a dirty word, but hopefully it comes back again because I just love, that's my kind of TV. I love a kind of setting a framework for things and then exploring it through different lenses. And so, yeah, I'm a sucker for anthologies.
Yeah.
What are you watching on TV?
You know, I don't get it as much time as I'd like for TV, unfortunately. But my favorite show right now is Succession. Just finished up the 3rd season of that. Huge fan. But I need some new shows, so I'm going to take those recommendations from you.
Yeah. And
so final question, what advice would you give to a 20-year-old you?
Wow, that's a good question. 20-year-old me was, I sometimes look back at 20-year-old me and wish I had a little bit more of 20-year-old me about me now. I didn't really sleep. I had a relentless energy to go do everything and to explore things and to kind of, I wanted to be a singer-songwriter, and I would go off and buy a medium format camera and shoot pictures over here. And there was an energy of exploration, which I loved. I think looking back at my generation now, we were constantly told, we were in that kind of, I'm 41, but I feel like a millennial. I'm not sure if I count as a millennial. I was of that generation where I was told that to make your passion your paycheck. And the thing, as a creative, the thing that makes you feel most alive, make that your job. And I don't think I'd say that anymore. Like, I love working in the industries that I work in. I sometimes think back to if I stayed in advertising, I would be a hell of a lot richer, but I would be so much more unhappy, because I love learning and I love new and I love innovation and things like that. But I think as a generation, I look at the idea of like, make your passion your paycheck, and then, then you've won. And I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's okay to have passions everywhere that aren't your job. I think it's great to have pure spaces where you make art and you do things that make you feel alive, but they don't have to pay. And the worst thing sometimes we can do, I think the feeling of stuckness that a lot of people I know feel, is because they've sat in that uncomfortable middle ground where the stuff they're making doesn't fulfill them, but they're too tired when they get home from work to do anything else. And so they've let the joy of their creativity, they've let some things go so that they can continue to have a creative, in inverted commas, job or role, but they're not making things that make them feel alive. They're not leaving marks on the world that feel meaningful, and they're not fulfilled by the work that they do because their work has to pay them. And I think if there could be just something that would be, it would almost make your passion your paycheck, feels a generational curse for creatives, where I would say you go earn some money and do something, but then have that thing that's yours and that is pure and that doesn't have to pay the bills, where you're not scoring and gauging the value of your art by the money it brings in. Because I think that's where something breaks in the middle. The irony being, branded entertainment used to be that. Brand entertainment used to be that bit where we sacrificed art for money. But yeah, my piece of advice to 20-year-old me would be to keep your art pure and to find something you love to work in, but the two don't have to meet in the middle.
Yeah, great advice. And a way I've never looked at it, because I'm part of that same generational curse, as you say. But I love that advice. But really great conversation. Really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Nate.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and comment to help us spread the word. You can also find more insider content on the Assemble blog, and you can find me on all channels at Nate Watkin. And don't forget, if your producing team is in need of a project management solution, try Assemble today to streamline your production workflow. Our listeners received their first month free by utilizing the code Offscript, that's one word, at checkout. You have been listening to the Creatives Offscript podcast hosted by Assemble.